May 25th, 1951. London, just before dawn. Rain slicked the pavement outside a narrow townhouse in Bloomsbury, the kind of quiet street where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. Inside, the lights were still on. Two men moved quickly, coats already on, papers hastily folded and shoved into briefcases. There was no shouting, no last-minute debate, only urgency and fear. Guy Burgess glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. They were late. Donald MacLean stood rigid by the door, pale, jaw clenched, listening for footsteps that weren't there yet. Somewhere in London, he knew, the net was tightening. This was not how espionage was meant to end. No gunfire, no chase. Just the creeping certainty that someone, somewhere, had spoken, and that meant only one thing. The hunt had begun. Only hours earlier, inside a quiet office at MI5 headquarters, a senior counterintelligence officer had stared at a file he had hoped would never be confirmed. The name on the cover had been circled in red ink, MacLean Donald, Foreign Office. For months, fragments of intelligence had pointed in the same direction. Soviet knowledge that could only have come from the heart of British power. U.S. diplomatic cables discussed in Moscow almost word for word. Nuclear secrets appearing in places they had no right to be. Someone high up was leaking. And now, finally, the Americans had said the word the British dreaded: intercepts. Across the Atlantic, inside a secure room in Washington, CIA officers leaned over decrypted Soviet communications. Venona, Burrow cables, partially broken but devastating in implication. The messages spoke in code names and fragments, but the pattern was unmistakable. A Soviet source inside the British establishment had been feeding Moscow for years. One CIA analyst tapped the table softly and said it aloud. "We're not hunting an agent. We're hunting a colleague." That realization changed everything. Back in London, MI5 moved cautiously. Too cautiously. They did not arrest MacLean. They did not confront him. They wanted more proof. Time, they believed, was on their side. They were wrong. Someone, to this day, never officially named, warned Burgess. And Burgess warned MacLean. By the time British authorities realized their mistake, the townhouse in Bloomsbury was empty. The two men vanished into the gray morning, boarded a ship at Southampton, and disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. They would resurface months later, in Moscow, alive, protected, and celebrated. Inside Western intelligence services, the shock was immediate and corrosive. If MacLean had escaped, someone else had helped him, and that meant the betrayal was deeper than anyone had imagined. The name that surfaced next was not spoken openly at first. It was whispered. Or Kim Philby. Philby was everything Western intelligence trusted. A decorated MI6 officer, former head of counterintelligence against the Soviet Union, liaison to the CIA in Washington. He drank with Americans, joked with them, reassured them, and all the while, he was quietly watching them tear themselves apart. In Washington, CIA counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton, paced his office late into the night. A thin man, sharply dressed, eyes hollow from years of suspicion, Angleton had built his career on one belief. The Soviets never sent just one spy. MacLean was not an exception. He was proof. If Philby was compromised, if someone that senior could be working for Moscow, then the entire Western intelligence system might already be lost. Angleton stopped trusting files, then colleagues, then reality itself. What followed was not an investigation. It was a purge without orders. Careers stalled. Operations were frozen midstream. Promising agents in Eastern Europe stopped responding, not because they had failed, but because they had been betrayed. Men and women were recalled from the field, quietly questioned, quietly sidelined. No charges, no trials, just silence. The Cold War did not erupt into open conflict. But inside intelligence agencies, it turned inward. Spies began hunting spies. And it wasn't only the West. In Moscow, the KGB read the same signals differently and reached the same conclusion. If the British and Americans were compromised, then surely the Soviets were too. Officers returning from foreign postings were interrogated. Some were demoted. Some were reassigned to meaningless desk jobs. Others simply disappeared from circulation. No announcements, no explanations, just closed doors. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a battle of ideology or borders. It was a war of paranoia, a war where the most dangerous enemy was not the man across the table, but the one sitting beside you, and it had only just begun. February 1952, Washington, D.C., late evening. The lights were still on in James Jesus Angleton's office, long after most of the building had gone dark. Outside the window, the city slept. Inside, Angleton paced slowly, deliberately, as if movement itself were the only thing keeping his thoughts from collapsing inward. On his desk lay a single photograph, not a mugshot, not an arrest photo, a group picture. British and American intelligence officers standing shoulder to shoulder at a reception years earlier, smiling, relaxed, drinks in hand, men who trusted one another. Angleton stared at it as if it were evidence from a crime scene, because now he believed it was. McLean's escape had done something irreversible. It had shattered the last comforting assumption of Western intelligence. That betrayal was rare, isolated, manageable. The Soviet Union, Angleton believed, did not gamble on lone agents. They planted systems, networks, redundancy. One spy could fail, two could be compromised. But a web could survive indefinitely. And if that web existed, then every successful Soviet countermove, every collapsed operation in Eastern Europe, every agent who vanished without explanation suddenly made sense. Too much sense. Inside CIA headquarters, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. Field reports stopped being celebrated and started being questioned. Success itself became suspicious. An agent who delivered too much, too cleanly, was no longer impressive. He was dangerous. Angleton began quietly pulling files. Polish operations, Czechoslovak contacts, Hungarian networks that had gone silent without warning. He noticed patterns others had missed or refused to see, names recurring in briefings, handlers overlapping, intelligence moving too smoothly from one desk to another. To Angleton, it looked less like coincidence and more like choreography. The purge did not announce itself. There were no memos declaring investigations, no formal charges, no hearings. Instead, careers simply stalled. An officer expecting a promotion found his transfer delayed indefinitely. A promising field operative was suddenly reassigned to desk work. Travel approvals slowed. Security clearances were under review. People began to notice who stopped being invited to meetings and who stopped answering their phones. In Europe, the consequences were lethal. Agents who had risked everything to spy for the West, men and women who passed documents, photographed installations, memorized schedules, began disappearing, not arrested publicly, not tried, simply gone. Some were pulled into side rooms by local security forces and never seen again. Others vanished on routine errands. A few were found later, broken, silent, or dead, their usefulness exhausted. From Washington and London, it looked like the Iron Curtain tightening. But Angleton suspected something worse. He believed the Soviets were not just reacting. They were anticipating. Across the Atlantic, MI6 was fighting its own quiet collapse. The whisper of Kim Philby's name spread through corridors and private clubs, never spoken above a murmur. No one wanted to be the first to accuse a man so deeply embedded, so thoroughly trusted. Philby sensed the shift immediately. He had survived suspicion before. He knew its smell. The way conversations ended too quickly when he entered a room. The way questions lingered just a second too long. But this time, it felt different. This time, suspicion was no longer cautious. It was hungry. Philby adjusted as he always had. He smiled, drank, played the reassuring colleague, warned just enough, misdirected just enough to keep the chaos feeding itself. Because the more the West turned inward, the safer Moscow became. The hunt did not need to be guided anymore. It was self-sustaining. Oh. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB watched with satisfaction and growing unease. The collapse of Western operations was encouraging. But it raised an uncomfortable question. If the British and Americans were riddled with spies, then why wouldn't the same be true at home? The logic that fueled Western paranoia did not stop at the Iron Curtain. It crossed it. By late 1952, KGB officers returning from postings abroad were quietly summoned for debriefings. Not the routine kind. These were longer, sharper, conducted behind closed doors with no notes allowed. Questions were repeated, details checked against archives, associations examined. Some officers emerged pale and shaken. Others did not emerge at all. Files were sealed, assignments erased, names quietly removed from internal directories. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, the message was clear. Trust no one. Oh. What had begun as counterintelligence was mutating into something far more dangerous. A system designed to detect betrayal had started producing it. Men destroyed colleagues to save themselves. Officers withheld information not from the enemy, but from their own superiors. Intelligence slowed, then fractured, then froze entirely in some regions. The Cold War did not explode outward. It imploded inward. And somewhere, beneath layers of suspicion and silence, the truth became almost impossible to locate. Because once a system begins hunting ghosts, every shadow looks guilty, and every loyal man looks like a traitor waiting to be exposed. The War of Paranoia had entered its most lethal phase. March 1953, Berlin after midnight. Snow fell in thin, quiet sheets along the border streets, settling into the cracks of pavement and the folds of abandoned posters peeling from brick walls. In a narrow apartment overlooking the sector line, a man sat in the dark, coat still on. Radio turned low enough to be felt more than heard. He had been told not to move, not to contact anyone, not to trust the signal unless it came twice. It never did. By dawn, the apartment was empty. In Washington, Angleton marked another name in pencil. Not crossed out, not circled, just paused. The agent in Berlin had not failed. The transmission had been clean, the timing correct, the dead drop untouched. And yet, within 48 hours, East German security had sealed the building, arrested 2 neighbors, and quietly erased the contact network. It was perfect, too perfect. Angleton leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. To him, perfection was proof of contamination. The web was still there. Inside CIA headquarters, fear had taken on a new shape. No one said the word purge. No one needed to. Desks were rearranged. Teams reshuffled. Long-standing partnerships quietly dissolved. Officers who had worked together for years now communicated through intermediaries, as if proximity itself were dangerous. People began keeping private notebooks, not of secrets, but of impressions. Who asked too many questions, who asked none at all, who seemed relieved when an operation was canceled. Paranoia had become procedural. In London, MI6 was unraveling along similar lines, though with British restraint masking the damage. Philby watched it happen from inside. He noticed the delays, the sudden second opinions, the way junior officers hesitated before speaking freely in meetings. He heard his name less often, which told him everything. Suspicion was moving inward. Toward him, Philby did what he had always done best. Nothing. He did not run. He did not protest. He did not overcorrect. He continued to attend dinners, continued to drink with colleagues, continued to offer reassurance, wrapped in dry humor and institutional memory. And quietly, methodically, he fed Moscow just enough to keep the chaos alive, because the more the West doubted itself, the less it could act. And inaction, during the Cold War, was victory. In Eastern Europe, the cost was measured in disappearances. A courier in Prague missed a meeting and was never heard from again. A source in Warsaw stopped transmitting mid-sentence. A handler in Budapest vanished on his way to work. Western intelligence labeled them lost contacts. Local authorities used a different word: resolved. Angleton studied each case obsessively, mapping timelines across walls, pinning photographs beside typed summaries. To outsiders, it looked unhinged. To him, it was the only way to impose order on a system that had begun devouring itself. He no longer trusted interrogations. He trusted patterns. And the patterns told him something terrifying. The Soviets were not guessing. They were waiting. Across the Iron Curtain, the KGB's satisfaction had curdled into anxiety. Stalin was dead, and uncertainty filled the vacuum he left behind. New leadership demanded answers. Accountability. Guarantees. If Western services were collapsing under paranoia, the Kremlin wanted to ensure the same infection had not already taken hold at home. So the questions began, quietly, systematically. Officers returning from Vienna, Paris, Stockholm, all neutral ground postings, were summoned for extended reviews. Their reports were compared line by line against archived versions. Minor discrepancies became major concerns. An officer who could not remember a dinner conversation from 3 years earlier was marked. An officer who remembered too much was marked faster. Some were reassigned. Some were pensioned off early. Some were transferred to positions where they could do no damage and gather no intelligence. And a few simply vanished. No death certificates, no notifications, no mention in official records. The KGB did not call it a purge. It called it correction. By late 1953, intelligence operations across Europe had slowed to a crawl. The flow of information became uneven, hesitant, fragmented. Messages were delayed not by enemy action, but by internal fear. Officers withheld reports until they were absolutely certain, which meant reports arrived too late to matter. The Cold War did not pause, but intelligence did. Or Angleton noticed the change and mistook it for confirmation. The absence of disaster, he believed, meant the system was finally working, that the web was tightening. In reality, it was strangling itself. Good agents were sidelined. Risk-takers were eliminated. Innovation died quietly under layers of approval and suspicion. What remained was safe and blind. By the end of the year, something fundamental had shifted. The intelligence war was no longer about gathering secrets. It was about surviving scrutiny, and that was far more dangerous. Because when survival becomes the mission, truth becomes expendable. And once truth is expendable, anything can be justified. The ghost hunt had reached its breaking point. January 1954. Washington, D.C., early morning. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving the city muted and pale beneath a low winter sky. Inside CIA headquarters, the corridors were already busy, but the movement felt mechanical. People walking with purpose, eyes forward, conversations cut short the moment someone unfamiliar approached. This was what survival looked like now. James Jesus Angleton arrived early, as he always did. He removed his coat, hung it carefully, and sat down at his desk without turning on the overhead light. He preferred the lamp. It kept the shadows contained. On his desk lay 3 files, all unrelated, all troubling, and all in his mind connected. One involved a Hungarian asset who had voluntarily walked into a Soviet security office and confessed. Another detailed a Polish network that had dismantled itself before arrests were made. The third described a British intelligence officer whose reports had grown cautious, too cautious, just weeks before contact was lost. Angleton read slowly, underlining nothing, making no notes. He no longer trusted ink. To write something down was to give it permanence. And permanence, in a system this unstable, was dangerous. Down the hall, an officer waited outside a closed door. He had been summoned without explanation. No agenda, no time limit. Just a request to come alone. Inside the room, 2 men sat at opposite ends of a table. No tape recorder, no stenographer, no official start to the meeting. They asked him to talk. About his last posting. About colleagues he trusted. About conversations he barely remembered having. The questions circled, returning to the same moments from different angles, searching not for truth, but for inconsistency. When it was over, the officer was thanked politely and told he could return to his duties. He never did. His clearance was temporarily suspended. His transfer delayed, his phone calls unanswered. Within weeks, his desk was reassigned. In London, MI6 officers experienced the same quiet erosion. Meetings grew shorter, decisions slower, authority fragmented. Files were copied and recopied, each layer adding distance between action and accountability. No one wanted to be the person who approved the wrong operation. No one wanted their signature attached to failure, so nothing moved. But Kim Philby watched the paralysis with professional interest. He did not celebrate it. Celebration drew attention. Instead, he adjusted his reporting to Moscow. Less dramatic, more observational. He described mood shifts, hesitations, silences. To Soviet handlers, this information was gold. It told them when to wait. Across Europe, Western intelligence stations began operating in isolation. Berlin stopped coordinating with Vienna. Paris stopped trusting Rome. Messages passed through too many hands, stripped of urgency, softened by caution. And in that vacuum, Eastern Bloc security services regained the initiative. They did not need brilliance. They needed patience. In Moscow, KGB leadership met behind heavy doors, insulated from rumor, but not immune to fear. The ghost hunt in the West had confirmed their worst suspicions. Intelligence services were fragile things, dependent on trust more than technology, and trust was the easiest weapon to destroy. But success bred paranoia. If Western agencies could implode from suspicion, then Soviet ones could too. Orders were issued quietly. Reviews intensified. Loyalty audits expanded. The mirror effect was complete. One KGB officer, recently returned from Scandinavia, sat through 3 days of questioning over a discrepancy in a travel log. The mistake was trivial. A train departure misremembered by 30 minutes. It was enough. He was reassigned to an archive position, far from operations. His career ended without explanation. Another officer never returned from questioning. His name vanished from personnel lists. By mid-1954, intelligence gathering on both sides had slowed to its lowest point in years. Leaders still demanded certainty, but certainty no longer existed, only fragments and fear. Angleton reviewed a final report that morning and set it aside without comment. Outside his office, phones rang. Typewriters clattered. The machinery of intelligence continued to operate, but it was hollow. A system built to see clearly had blinded itself, and no one knew how to stop it, because to admit the problem was to admit doubt, and doubt in the ghost hunt was the first sign of guilt. The collapse was not loud, it was administrative, and it was almost complete. Autumn 1954, Washington, D.C., late afternoon. The light slanted low across the Potomac, turning the river dull and metallic. Inside CIA headquarters, the day wound down without ceremony. Reports were filed, phones were answered, doors closed softly. From the outside, the machinery of intelligence appeared intact. Inside, something essential had been lost. James Jesus Angleton sat alone, the desk lamp casting a narrow island of light across the blotter. He read a memorandum twice, then set it aside without comment. It recommended restoring several sidelined officers to active duty. No evidence of wrongdoing had ever been found. The delays, it suggested, had gone on long enough. Angleton did not sign it. He did not refuse it either. He simply let it wait. By now, the ghost hunt had produced its own mythology. In briefings and private conversations, officers spoke in euphemisms. Compromised environments, security sensitivities, operational caution. No one said fear. No one said mistake, and no one said enough. The logic that had driven the purge was difficult to unwind. If the threat had been overstated, then lives and careers had been destroyed unnecessarily. If it had been understated, then restraint was reckless. Either conclusion was intolerable, so the system chose a third option: silence. In London, the reckoning arrived differently. Kim Philby felt it in the air before he saw it in writing. The invitations slowed. The informal chats dried up. When questions came, they came from men he did not know well. Phrased carefully, delivered politely. The old trust was gone. In 1955, Philby was quietly forced out of MI6. Officially, for reasons of judgment. Unofficially, because suspicion had finally become unavoidable. He did not protest. He waited, as he always had. Years later, when Philby finally defected to Moscow, the revelation landed with a hollow thud. There was no shock left to spend, only exhaustion. The betrayal confirmed Angleton's darkest belief, that the enemy had indeed been inside all along. But it also raised a quieter, more uncomfortable question. If Philby had been one of the ghosts, how many others had been hunted who were not? That question had no operational value, so it was set aside. In Moscow, the KGB conducted its own internal accounting. Careers were restored quietly. Others were erased completely. No public acknowledgement was made of excess or error. The institution, like its Western counterparts, preserved itself by denying its own damage. The Cold War demanded certainty, and certainty demanded forgetting. By the late 1950s, intelligence services on both sides began to recover in measurable ways. New technologies emerged. New doctrines replaced old ones. Younger officers, unmarked by the early purges, entered the field. But the culture had changed. Trust was conditional. Transparency was dangerous. And loyalty was something to be proven repeatedly, never assumed. The ghost hunt had left scars beneath the surface, invisible but permanent. Angleton remained in his post for decades. He outlasted presidents, outlasted directors, outlasted many of the men he had once suspected. To some, he was a guardian who had held the line against an unseen enemy. To others, he was the architect of an internal collapse that set American intelligence back a generation. Both interpretations were true, and neither fully explained the cost. The real casualties of the ghost hunt were not the spies who escaped, nor even those who were exposed. They were the ones who vanished quietly. The ones who were right, but suspected. The ones who learned, too late, that loyalty offered no protection against fear. In the Cold War, being innocent was not enough. History would later frame this period as a phase, a necessary overreaction in an unprecedented conflict. Declassified files would reveal fragments of truth, enough to outline what happened, but never enough to assign clean blame. And perhaps that was fitting, because the ghost hunt was not the result of a single decision or a single man. It was the inevitable outcome of a system built on secrecy, fighting an enemy that thrived on doubt. The Cold War would continue for decades after. There would be crises, near wars, close calls that nearly ended everything. But long before missiles were counted and treaties signed, something quieter had already been proven, that a system designed to protect itself can, under enough pressure, turn inward and become its own greatest threat. The spies did not stop killing spies because the war ended. They stopped because the damage had already been done. This was not the story of heroes and villains. It was the story of institutions under fear, of the men who believed they were preventing disaster, and in doing so, created another. The war in the shadows did not explode. It consumed itself. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, there was no enemy left to blame.